just for some context, the books that are going in circulation above us on the stage are either selections that the speakers have made that from the library and curated items we've selected to sort of accompany their talks, and also they're related to the collections on the tables in the back, which are curated to also reflect the sort of ongoing loop of topics, so that way you know what this is all about.
And to introduce the group of speakers and collaborators who are joining us on stage, we have those of us who are involved in the library, the simulation, and the artworks which are building off of the library collection. My name is Sarah Hamerman. I'm a librarian, and I took on a role in organizing and cataloging the library that we have here today. And to my left is David Hecht, who was the architect of the library, as well as contributing over 400 books from his personal collection to the Cybernetics library. And I'd also like to introduce the designers of the simulation, Francis Tseng and Dan Taeyoung, and Austin Smith, who is here in the green, created the artwork that's using the CNC to kind of inscribe the topic maps of the books that are being checked into the simulation.
Okay, I'll just ask a few questions and then allow for more discussion amongst the people up here on stage, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So, when you started to plan a Cybernetics conference, when did the brilliant idea come to you that a library had to be an integral part of that multi-platform event, and why?
So personally, I believe that it was really through my conversations with Sam and David that the idea of the library came about. We actually were really interested in some of your writing that you just discussed about library infrastructures and a few library projects out there in the world that are sort of redefining the structure of the libraries in ways that seemed quite apt and relevant to the cybernetic library. A project called the Sitterwork Library, which is in Switzerland, uses RFID to dynamically locate books within their collection, was certainly an inspiration. And thinking about this relationship within existing library systems between collections of physical books, the metadata within the library catalog, the electronic resources and database systems, and the infrastructures that move materials back and forth. These kind of broadly interlinked and overlaid systems that are being built for the purposes of public systems and services, of educational discourses, felt really relevant to kind of the goals of the conference.
Yeah, Sarah really clearly laid out the sort of infrastructural and conceptual sort of framework of it, and we saw that as a sort of cybernetic system par excellence. It circulates, there's feedback, there's adaptation, there are decision-making processes that are sometimes obscure, but sort of change the shape of your interaction with the system. But also something, for example, that we've observed a lot today and in the days leading up is the sort of libraries as a sort of site of exchange of knowledge and information that doesn't just happen through the sort of content in it, but happens as a context. So it's that cybernetic architecture where being surrounded by a certain set of information or possibilities for information and people who are trying to access that creates a new context for new kinds of knowledge to be generated. So there have been conversations in there that have gone on for already, I think, extended periods. And I think seeing what that produces is part of the motivation, that it's not just a collection of books, but it's sort of another point of access to the system that is the whole conference, which is a source of generating new interactions and new knowledge and new possibilities. So yeah.
And if you're thinking of kind of, sorry, like a Bauhausian sense, where there's like an uber art form and then the lesser art forms, even the featured presentations are informed by all of these books. So there's not necessarily a hierarchy. Everything is kind of cyclically informed by each other. So maybe just to bring in some of the other folks on stage, what do you regard as, to use some terminology from earlier panels, the affordances and limitations of the different components of the library? What new things, new kind of aesthetic experiences, like forms of access to the simulation, for example, make possible, or the online catalog, or the, I'm sorry, I don't know what to call the project that you're doing. What I
Drawing
call it.
machine or something?
Okay, the drawing machine, sure, yes.
Maybe I think so I worked on the simulation with Francis, and in terms of affordances, maybe when you check out a book and it forms into a planet, lands on a planet, turns into the planet of the conference of attendees is visualized as a galaxy. I think maybe in terms of affordances, it's like representing the same joy in a certain way that you get in the library, where you're like excited to look at a series of books, but maybe don't have enough time to read through all of them, but understand that you're either accessing knowledge that you already had because you've read it before, so it's like embodied knowledge kind of outside of yourself, or like a hope for something you want to read. And I would say maybe in some of the limitations or excitements is the fact that it's trying to capture that kind of emotional joy in some sense of like the wonder of these planets, which is why everyone has these badges. But loosely, one of the hopes was, I think that Francis and I wanted to enshrine the entire conference in a feedback loop, because you check it out and eventually the speakers are asked questions as a result of this process that we have like some part of the feedback, where like attendees having listened to speakers check out a book that turns into a question that is answered by attendees. And so I think in some ways, one of the hopes is this kind of loose feedback, and we're trying to see what will happen today as a result of that.
Sure, yeah, I guess to sort of build on what Dan was saying, just to like elaborate a little bit more on the questions, which was really fun to do. We ended up extracting questions. So where we could, we obtained the full text of the books in the library, like digital versions of them. And then we did a pretty simple way of just trying to extract all the questions within them. But then we ended up with like 63,000 questions. And a lot of them, as you could probably guess, are really mixed quality. And so we ended up narrowing it down to 7,500, which we then went through by hand, the rest of them. And that was kind of fun, just to just get question after question after question, totally devoid of context. And some of those questions were super bizarre. Some of them were, I think, strengthened by the lack of context. And hopefully that, if a question repeats itself or something, it'll be for a different speaker in a different context, and it'll sort of take on a new flavor and meaning. So hoping that happens. But.
And what does the drawing machine add to the feedback of discourse?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like sort of the status of the library as an archive, kind of along the conversation of the increased intersection of logistics and the archive, increasingly pulls away this act of browsing, this sort of event where people can peruse. And oftentimes it's outsourced to a web interface or further and further away from actually making contact with the material itself. So from the archive and the collection of books that we have here, part of the discussion about how the drawing machine would respond to CyberSim and the larger project was to try to encapsulate the way in which people's interest in what they browsed for got registered, and it sort of accumulated collectively. And we were building off of the kind of orrery or larger galactic metaphor that the simulation was building off of, and kind of transferring it in a temporal sense more into geological time. And that the collective interest of the people at the conference and what they were looking at were sort of sedimentation belts that were adding upon each other. And it's a moment to sort of get a visualization or a snapshot in a moment of what the collective interest was that wasn't discrete per person, but a kind of consensus or an overall sense of where we as a group were today.
That's great. You can hear lots of echoes of things like Fanny Barbush's Memex and Paul Atlay's Mondotech, which also themselves were kind of visions of epistemological architecture that in their mind would scale up to something that was like a galactic way of knowing, a world mind. And furniture, the design of furniture and shelving was an integral part of their vision. And I wondered if you could say a bit about your inspiration for designing the physical space.
Yeah, well, it's sort of first off, it's important to mention that it was a very collaborative effort. The main shelving is on loan from the Guild, the Prime Produce, and Dan had designed those, and we had conversations long ago about these kind of blocks that could be used for many different things that, you know, could be put together, and this much later emerged. And then in the library, the modular processes of the shelves and also the display tables and all the sort of things, there's a deep tradition of sort of modular architecture. I think in your talk, you talk about certain modular libraries that can sort of reform with communities that use them. And so one of the inspirations that's going on through there that looking back, I realize this is in there, is some people might have seen the software catalog, in which it's a show from 68, 70, at the Jewish Museum, where a lot of very radical approaches to information interaction and physical space, and I mean, it's wild stuff in there. And one of the interesting things that the Architecture Machine Group, which has come up a number of times today, did was a simulation using gerbils and little blocks that were meant to represent a city. And so the gerbils would move around this sort of space, bumping the blocks and reforming the city. And then a robotic arm would come and straighten out the towers that they had nudged into place, and thus forming a city based on their own activities. So the library is kind of meant not to be a circulatory thing that is, you know, everything's on wheels and everything's kind of getting nudged around, and it's changed multiple times in the past 24 hours, and it'll change again and again. So yeah, that's, you know, it's sort of the cybernetic in that sort of way that affordances are opportunities, right? Like the Gibsonian sense of affordance, where it's something that creates a possibility for action and a possibility for some kind of relationship between in the original sense, it's an organism and their environment. And so in this case, it's like an attendee and the first layer of environment that they're in, which might be the physical library, but then the second layer, which is the simulation, but then the larger layer, that's the conference, which then loops back into sitting and hearing a question from a book that you picked out come to a speaker. And so it's, yeah, the loops are really the inspiration.
We even have kind of satellite collections within this one little space. You have the library proper over there, the curated tables over there, which are based on kind of expert input, the people who were invited, supposedly. I'm putting that in scare quotes. And then these cubes behind us, which are supposed to be kind of temporally determined based on who's up on stage at a given moment. And this leads to my next question about, as you probably have known, if you've lived in New York or really any city for the past 10 years or so, there have been lots of little pop-up libraries. Libraries have been kind of a big aesthetic inspiration at many major museums. There have been kind of satellite libraries curated by artists. And this is something that Andrew Bacone of the Reanimation Library and I have spoken about. Like, what does it mean for them, or particularly not trained librarians, to call them what they're creating libraries? And I'm not trying to be the thought or the word police here. That said, there is something specifically about librarianship, often a feminized profession that is based on care, which, as I'm sure has come up today, is often kind of undervalued. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the principles or standards of librarianship that you made sure to instill in the project here, and where you might feel that the ideologies of standard librarianship didn't quite fit and you had to develop your own system.
So your mention of Andrew Bacone's project, the Reanimation Library, was great. Andrew's a partner and contributor to our library today, as well as a big inspiration to the project. And he actually does have a library science background that he has kind of transferred into his practice as an artist, creating a library of kind of books whose textual information is outdated, but whose visual content can be used to scan and reinterpret as a site of artistic experimentation. And these kinds of projects of alternative libraries were created by artists as a way of experiencing collections of books in a way that's tactile, in a way that's social, in a way that is about circulation and exchange outside of the normative research project, was a major reason why we invited the Reanimation Library and Wendy's Subway, and an inspiration for what we were trying to do here. In terms of kinds of the standards of librarianship that we applied. We knew for the simulation that the tagging data would have to be standardized so that we could group books together and so that we could create the kinds of connections and topic mappings which you can see and interact with here today. We pulled in Library of Congress subject tags and supplemented those with some broader topic tags which would create more overarching themes within the collection as a way of structuring the metadata in our library thing catalog, which was then pulled into the work that Francis and Dan created. In terms of the way our physical collection is organized, we really rejected again and pushed against the notion of having like a call number system where there's a specific shelf order that books are in, because we wanted the collection to function dynamically. We wanted this kind of circulation through the stage and through the discussions and through the curated tables to be reflected in the happenstance of how people were encountering materials in the collection. So we have this more fluid system that was exciting for me as someone who practices librarianship in my professional life to be able to place within the library. And another thing that this project sort of is distinct from in terms of working in an institutional library versus doing this is that here in the Cybernetics conference, the library is kind of functioning as this central node through which all of the other talks and information are passing through. It's something that's highlighted, whereas there's this tradition within the professional practice of librarianship of librarians to be represented as helpers of their labor to be kind of rendered invisible in relation to the work of academics, of curators, of these people who are more forward-facing researchers. So making visible the library as a kind of infrastructure was something that we really wanted to do in this project.
Just to give a lot of credit to the organizers at the beginning, Sam and Melanie and Francis, it was their sort of idea to have a library, and they had the seeds of a really beautiful idea that we were then able to work on, all of us together. So it's really also something I think it doesn't happen much in these kinds of projects where there's a genuine sense of collaboration that led to it.
I think a lot, I probably am, 0 minutes. So I should not say that.
Final point.
Okay, 1 point. I think a lot of us, I'm probably speaking on behalf of everybody on this stage right now. I think libraries would love to have much more interaction with people representing all the areas of professional practice and interests that you have. First of all, because library history, the history of clerical work, is essentially the history of computing. It's often not mined. Thank you. And libraries are often a great outlet for the types of skills. You know, Allison and Mimi were talking about their students wanting to work for Google and Facebook. Libraries are going to pay less, but it's one of the institutions left in the United States that the public actually still has faith in. So it's a great outlet for all of your design and computing skills. Yeah, just that final plug. I hope that was worth it. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
That's the mic. If you're Austin, you have the mobile mic.
Very cybernetic.
Thank you, everyone. This is so inspiring. I wanted to ask a simple question about the name of the simulation. Cyber Sim with a Y. Obviously, since simulation has an I in it, there's must be some sort of conscious allusion to Cyber Sin, the project in Chile in the early 70s. And Eden Medina's book, Cybernetic Revolutionaries, is like the sort of an amazing, almost anthropological account of that. But in that, there were also another version of that project called Cyber Folk, which was a kind of proto-social network idea that never was realized, due to a number of reasons, including Allende's assassination. But so I wanted to ask you about the name and why it was important to name it Cyber Sim and not Cyber something else that gets, and I think maybe incorporate some of these other more social, relational ambitions of the visualization and the whole process.
I guess speaking for myself at least, CyberSyn has always been a very inspirational project, and so I think the name is just partly an homage, even though there's not like a super tight overlap. I don't know. Maybe Dan has.
Yeah, I think the name is an homage. In relation to the social aspects, one of the aspects is that similar planets aggregate together, and one of our hopes was that conferences are already kind of petri dishes of social norms in the best possible way. Everyone I've met here has been really interesting and interested and kind of multifaceted, and so one of the hopes, maybe just to speak on the social norm, is this isn't really an answer to your question, is that like the relationships between planets are the relationships between people, and thus we're somehow creating a different petri dish of a conference with the usual kind of aspects plus a lot of different others, and kind of brewing it and seeing what happens, and watching and hoping that the social relationships between people, starting from the lanyards to the library to the speakers to the CNC machine to the simulation, generates a new social condition or a new kind of bacterial growth within that petri dish. So yeah, that's a somewhat answer to your question.
We want one more.
So one of the moments that I had in that library kind of caught me off guard, which is that I picked up a book and I was looking at it and super interested in it. Obviously, couldn't read it in that moment. And when I went to put it back, I sort of had to make the decision of, do I put it back in the same place or do I put it back somewhere else? And what would be more in line with the kind of dynamism that you guys are going for? And I was wondering if there's maybe future builds of this that you think that you could begin to sort of trace those trails of how books actually move within this kind of dynamic system.
I think David could speak to this. I may have actually mentioned it earlier with the Sitterwork Library. They are using RFID so that the books are not only tagged in terms of the relationship between the physical book and the metadata, they're also tagged in terms of their location within the space. So no matter where the book is reshelved, its particular location is findable within the system. It's kind of bringing that into the space of the library from shipping and logistics systems, which are developed commercially, but is a really interesting way to think about discovery and breaking down the kind of strict organization. So David has actually visited that library, so if you could talk about that would be great.
To go there, it's a really strange place. There's a library, an art foundry, a gallery, and sort of artist residences in this half of a factory. The other half of is still an active industrial site, and then there's this crazy library in this amazing space. There's also there's a book about it that you can see later, but there's a material library along with the books, and the RFID tags are read by two CNC book scanners that run along the shelves. And when you want to get a book, you find something in the catalog, it tells you their location in meters from the origin. And there's a strip of tape running along the shelves that tells you how to physically find them. But there's also the layer that's similar to our layer of the simulation and the catalog, where the tagging, or rather when you take a book out and put it on this table that reads the RFID, you form a collection that gets cataloged as a collection. So anytime you look at their catalog online, it shows a shelf with books that are out, and you can click on a book and see what collection it's part of and what other collections it's been a part of. So they're trying to actually do that tracing operation of understanding how people are using the books, and they were all donated by, or the seed of the collection was a donation by this crazy collector who they were trying to mimic his thought process in a certain way. And I mean, just to go inward for a second, when I'm standing in that library and I see so many of my books around, people have been talking about things, and I just immediately start to think of where in that space that knowledge is hiding. And I knew where everything was when we started because I saw where it was shelved and I can keep track. And so, I mean, just personally, when the books are moved, I'm tracing what books have moved because I don't know where they are anymore, and my memory palace is now screwed up. So, you know, I get back to me at the end of the day and I'll tell you what, you know, and then we can compare that with the simulation and see which books have actually,
Well, there's a whole aesthetic tradition, too, of artists playing, you know, just denaturalizing the standardized classification system. There are people like Nina Cacciadorian who make poetry, going back to Allison's talk, with what's words on the spines, people organizing their book by color, which might be a little OCD, but also still reveals some really interesting kind of why are all books about the ocean have blue spines, for instance. So there's some interesting kind of things to be learned by playing around with aesthetic forms of classification, too.
And something that, you know, the way that people are interacting with these books is not as traditional research materials. It creates this kind of context where the library is a site of experimentation and play through the simulation and the feedback that it's generating. And it's interesting to look at this and think about how can that type of play be a research strategy? How can it redefine the way that we use our libraries, both here and maybe as a model for libraries within broader society?
Wait, I have a quick story. There's a story called HackerCone, where Marvin Minsky was wiring a neural net, and he was wiring it randomly, and his advisor came in and was like, why are you wiring it up randomly? Why are you giving random values to your neural net? And he said, well, I'm doing it so that the neural net the AI won't have any preconceptions. And then his advisor said, if you close your eyes, does the world stop existing? AKA, the fact that the neural net is random wirely doesn't mean that it doesn't have any preconceptions. So when you start reorganizing the library, we could say, actually, we do have a very strict organizational system. It's just highly unpredictable and dependent on the whims of all of the users and their kind of unconscious sorting. But it's very, very deliberate, but highly, highly difficult to understand.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.